Hello everybody. I think that the claims trans identity makes about reality are worth interrogating and assessing. If that bothers you, you won't like this video. In this video, we will be looking at ContraPoints' video called The Aesthetic. I've already done a live reaction to this video before, which I will link below if you'd like to see my response to it in real time. The purpose of this video is to significantly condense my criticisms for your viewing pleasure. On that note, if you really like this video, then you might be interested in a response I did to ContraPoints on autogynephilia on this channel, so I will link that now. Also, if you really like this video, then you can express that with a like and a subscribe and all those good algorithm things. Hope you enjoy. Sometimes structuring these responses can be difficult, but in this case I know exactly where to begin. It's the first thing I need to address. Most ContraPoints videos are absolutely drenched in layers of irony. Contra doesn't do what I do and present quite frankly and sincerely a series of genuine arguments. Rather, Contra has all sorts of characters saying all sorts of different things, interspersed with lots of intentionally comedic moments. Now obviously it wouldn't be fair for me to take clear jokes and present them as sincere criticisms. For example, at one point Contra attempts to entice this Tabby character into undressing without retreating to a private space, motivated by the desire for voyeuristic pleasure from looking at naked people.
Well, don't leave. You can change in front of me. I'm not a prude. I'm gonna go behind the curtain. I like looking at naked people.
Now, I could take this comment and encourage you to view it in light of women's concerns about biological males entering their changing rooms for unsavory reasons.
I like looking at naked people.
I could do that.
I like looking at naked people.
But of course that would be wrong, because clearly this is just a joke. It's a satire or parody or something. I would undeniably be poisoning the well if I kept playing that clip.
I like looking at naked people.
Over and over.
I like looking at naked people.
While suggesting it reveals something sinister.
I like looking at naked people.
You can see the point, I hope, about how these layers of irony and post-irony are quite difficult to engage with. Am I actually suggesting that this comment from Contra was some mask-off moment where sincere voyeuristic intentions were revealed? Or am I just repeatedly referencing it as if making a sincere criticism for reasons of absurdist humor? This confusion is why from here on out, my goal is to be able to cut through these tedious layers of irony and try my best not to contribute any additional layers myself. With this in mind, my assumption when engaging with this video is that the two primary interlocutors, Tabitha and Justine, are both representative of positions Contra holds to. Contra's video basically takes the form of a Socratic dialogue. I'm sorry, Socrates, please don't be offended by the comparison. It's just the term. However, to coin a term, I would say that the principal dialogue of this video is more of a complementary Socratic dialogue than an adversarial Socratic dialogue. To briefly define those two terms I just made up, an adversarial dialogue would be one where the goal of the dialogue is to set up one side to lose, thus revealing their position to be flawed, while a complementary dialogue would be one where the goal is to synergize two oppositional thoughts into a singular, coherent thesis statement. This is what I mean when I say both sides of this debate represent positions Contra sincerely believes, and I interpret the goal of this video to be finding the perfect balance between the one position and the other. However, I also think that Contra clearly leans more towards one side than the other. Tabitha is a very well-defined character as distinct from Contra. Meanwhile, Justine is basically an author self-insert in this dialogue. My basis for saying that is that Justine looks pretty much identical to how Contra looks when not playing any kind of character. Indeed, my instinct that I will probably act on throughout this response is to refer to Justine simply as Contra. Therefore, while I will continue to recognize that Contra is very ironic and sarcastic and shouldn't be taken completely at face value, I will for the most part interpret Justine as mostly communicating Contra's sincerely held beliefs filtered through a slight comedic exaggeration. Now, I'm sure that some ContraPoints fans will want to understand Justine as slightly more satirical than I'm allowing for. This doesn't surprise me since, as we'll momentarily uncover, a lot of what Justine says is not good optics for trans activists. However, to address these fans, I will respond to a very highly upvoted comment from Contra's video that appears to be arguing we shouldn't take Justine as representing Contra's views. I think Natalie was maybe a little too subtle here in conveying how impossible Justine's advice is to actually follow, but she's very clear about it. At 9 minutes and 20 seconds, she says, "You need to be so good at makeup that every cis woman you know comes to you for advice." And 10 seconds later says, "Your hands are not tools, they're ornaments. This is impossible." So the basic argument there, if it's not clear, is that clearly the character of Justine is supposed to be a satire, because what Justine says is so rife with contradiction that this character must have been written to intentionally make no sense. The problem with this line of reasoning is that it neglects the possibility that maybe Contra's sincere efforts at argumentation are also filled with contradiction. For my part, this is the explanation I find more credible. I just enjoy the fact that the consensus amongst Contra's fans is, well, we can't interpret this character as a sincere reflection of Contra's views because the character's views are so incoherent and contradictory that they must be intended as satire. No, I'm afraid not. I suspect that's just Contra. At least Contra's ironic patron shoutout is less cringy than Philosophy Tube's in my previous response.
Why don't we fight the pageantry of fascism with pageantry of our own? And you know who's gonna make that happen? Who? Well-funded trans women. Patreon's in the description.
I mean, it's still a bit intrinsically cringy for a multi-millionaire who uploads videos like once a year to be suggesting that giving on Patreon is necessary for the fight against fascism. Won't catch me doing that when I'm a multi-millionaire, but until then, I can plug my Patreon as much as I like, so check it out. Now, because Contra's videos are so reliably style over substance, it means that I don't feel too guilty about taking my time before addressing these substantive points. And with that in mind, let's talk about one incredibly cringy moment in Contra's video. I'm going to let it play pretty much in full, but just in case there's still not enough context, Contra is referencing a debate against Blair White.
Well, the pink wig lost that debate so bad, it was embarrassing to watch. Not really. I mean, she was right, and her arguments were better. Tabby. Sweetie, honey, angel, darling, princess, baby. Arguments don't matter. How pretty you are matters.
I've acknowledged before on this channel that I don't think I'm a very good debater. I'm quite conflict averse and also have anxiety, so I tend to not assert my point very well in one-on-one discussions. However, as disappointing as my performance in previous debates might have been, I can't ever imagine writing a skit where a fictional character for whom I've written the dialogue will assert,
I mean, she was right, and her arguments were better.
Oof, it's so cringe. And I likewise can't imagine the impossible amounts of copium it takes to lose a debate and then retroactively attribute this to the fact that you only lost because you weren't pretty enough.
Arguments don't matter. How pretty you are matters.
It's so cringe.
It was embarrassing to watch.
I think one of the reasons it's so cringe is because it's so transparently bitter. Losing a debate is fine. Losing a debate and owning up to your poor performance is quite commendable, if I do say so myself. But what's not remotely creditable is losing a debate and then bitterly insisting that you only lost because you weren't pretty enough. It's more than bitter, frankly, it's borderline unhinged. Interestingly, since YouTube now has a function that lets you see what part of the video is the most replayed, I can reveal that the most replayed part of this video is... I suspect, and strongly hope, that these replays are from people seeking out concentrated doses of cringe fuel, because I can't conceive of anybody watching that clip back for reasons that would be complimentary of Contra. Although maybe I'm speaking too soon, because in the horrifyingly distorted world of the ContraPoints comment section, somebody genuinely commented, "Every ContraPoints video proves that ContraPoints is the only one thoughtful enough to debate with ContraPoints." I guess when you summarize your debate performance by saying that your arguments were better and you only lost because you weren't pretty enough, you're likely to foster a fan base who will sincerely say, Contra only lost the debate because nobody else is thoughtful enough to debate with ContraPoints.
Sweetie, honey, angel, darling, princess, baby.
So let's recap the cringe for your viewing pleasure. Contra lost the debate due to being anxious, awkward, and uncomfortable. Fair enough, no shame in that. And then Contra writes a fake conversation where two characters played by Contra agree that actually Contra was a great debater and had the best arguments and was fantastic and only lost due to not being pretty. And then the absolute cherry on the cherry bakewell is that laugh. Well, at least there aren't any other cringy moments in the video, right? Oh, okay, I feel like I'm being mean. So let me end this section with a positive. I actually really do like this joke.
Cis women, well, they're hopeless, aren't they? Fully clockable.
It's a good joke. I like a bit of absurdist comedy, and I just can't help but appreciate the humour in describing biological females as clockable. Admittedly, it is difficult not to read this as a joke making fun of trans identity. The joke is that a biological male who didn't wear an elaborate costume of femininity would be clockable, and thus the flawed inference is that a biological female doing the same must also be clockable. What makes this inference flawed though, and thus comedic, is that we know that biological females don't need to wear an elaborate costume and are still recognized as women because they are women. There's this moment that gets to something I find very interesting about Contra's videos. Tabby the cat girl goes on a rant defending being somebody who doesn't present in a feminine way and doesn't make an effort to, as it were, pass.
And I'm willing to stand up for the girls with beard shadow and deep voices, the girls even other trans women make fun of. And when, in the history of the world, has anyone but me ever stood up for them?
The problem with this is that Tabby doesn't actually look like your average trans furry with an anime Twitter profile. Instead, Tabby still looks very much like somebody who has indeed gone to substantial efforts to put on a costume of femininity and pass as a woman. Tabby chides Contra for going to so much effort to put on makeup just to sit at home.
Who puts on that much makeup to drink tea at home?
But it shouldn't escape your notice that Tabby is also wearing makeup in the exact same situation, and seemingly not even that much less of it. Similarly, Contra has a recurring character who is supposed to be a radical feminist. Of course, radical feminists quite reliably never wear any makeup at all, and yet Contra's radical feminist character of Abigail Cockbane seems to have undergone a substantial makeup routine before going out to spread the good word of radical feminism. So here we have two characters who shouldn't be wearing elaborate costumes of femininity like excessive makeup, and yet in both cases they very noticeably are. To me, it seems pretty obvious that Contra basically refuses to ever be seen without significant amounts of makeup. I don't think there is any other explanation for why even characters who clearly shouldn't be wearing makeup narratively are nonetheless caked in it. I think this is an interesting thing to consider in a video that is nominally about aesthetics. If the video is supposed to be defending the trans conception of aesthetics, it's worth exploring how Contra responds to and engages with the standard radical feminist critique that the over-reliance on makeup and other forms of costume from trans-identified males speaks to them not actually being women. Contra's main effort to engage with this argument appears to be a persistent conflation of the significance of femininity for trans-identified males and for biological females. When discussing why trans-identified males shouldn't reject a costume of femininity, Contra asserts that gender non-conforming cis women are marginalized.
Cis women, they're not doing womanhood in that way. Well, yeah, that's why those women are marginalized. They're going off the grid of what society recognizes as womanhood. You don't want to end up like that, do you?
The problem with this is that it's an equivocation fallacy. When discussing trans identity, it's clear that gender is conceptualized as a full-on costume of femininity extending to an elaborate and involved makeup routine. Contra attempts to conflate a trans-identified male not donning this costume with a non-trans woman being gender non-conforming. But the thing is, if a non-trans woman doesn't wear makeup, she isn't marginalized. My fiancé very rarely wears makeup, and I assure you that she isn't marginalized as a woman for going off the grid of femininity. My sister likewise very rarely wears makeup, and is not understood as being any less of a woman for this by anybody. Is my fiance living off the grid after having her womanhood rejected by society? Is my sister causing confusion everywhere she goes due to her rejection of a hyper-feminized costume of womanhood? No. It is utterly ridiculous to conflate women not wearing makeup with biological males doing the same. Trans-identified males who don't wear an elaborate costume of femininity would basically look like a shaved version of me. Has Contra ever seen an actual woman without makeup? They don't look like a shaved version of me. In a separate moment discussing whether trans-identified males should need to present in a feminine way, Contra asks what society thinks of gender non-conforming women.
There are bald women, bearded women, muscular women, wide-shouldered women. And what is society's opinion about those bald, bearded, wide-shouldered women?
As if the answer would be in some way comparable to how trans-identified males are viewed. In fact, Contra is basically saying to a biological male, don't look like these biological females look, or else people might think you're a man. Which is pretty absurd. While some people might negatively assess the appearance of some more mannish looking women, these women will still be recognized as women. By contrast, for Contra, looking like a woman is the most important thing for a trans-identified male.
You have to look like a f***ing woman.
This specifically means wearing a costume of stereotypical femininity. Basically, exactly what Contra wears in all videos playing all characters up to and including characters who it makes no sense to be wearing such a costume. Contra says that trans women need to overdo it sometimes,
but trans women have to overdo it,
or else they might be misgendered.
If you don't want to get misgendered, it helps to femme it up a little.
The problem is that this engagement with womanhood as nothing more than a costume that has to be exaggerated is utterly discontinuous with the experiences of most actual women. Contra's ultimate goal is to exaggerate the significance of biological females performing femininity in order to minimize the significance of how much trans-identified males rely on performing femininity. Contra wants you to be like, oh yeah, I guess all women face some pushback for not performing femininity, so that you'll think it's not too abnormal that trans-identified males have to cover themselves in makeup and make sure they have the perfect favorable lighting. But this is complete manipulation. Actual women are comfortable being seen without makeup because for actual women, their womanhood isn't a costume. So I think this idea that there is some parallel between the importance of presentation for trans-identified males and for women is nonsense, but Contra does ask an interesting question towards the beginning of the video.
What matters more, the way things are or the way things look?
I say it's an interesting question. It's also kind of a profoundly boring question, because the answer depends entirely on context, obviously. Like, so obviously that I feel like I'd be insulting your intellect if I gave an example. Also, sometimes both matter at the same time for different reasons. For example, sorry for insulting your intellect, but I can't help myself, what matters more, how many soldiers you have in your army, or how many soldiers it looks like you have? Well, how many it looks like you have is going to be hugely significant tactically, and could allow you to see off a much larger army. Your enemy might think you've got way more soldiers, so they wouldn't attack when if they did, they'd actually destroy you. So how many soldiers it looks like you have could be the difference between annihilation and living to fight another day. But also how many soldiers you actually have is very important, because when the time comes to actually engage the enemy, you can't defeat them with soldiers that aren't actually there. You can't win the war without soldiers, so how many soldiers you actually have is the ultimate determiner of victory. Despite this difference between appearance and reality being basically the opening question of the video, a thesis statement of sorts, Contra never actually engages with it, because of course not. You just saw what happens when somebody actually engages with that question, and it's a massive waste of time. But I guess, for the record, I'll address this as it relates to the idea of somebody being a woman. If somebody looks like a woman to me, but they aren't actually biologically female, then they are in fact not a woman. Simple. Contra never argues to the contrary because, like I say, Contra doesn't actually engage with the question. Tabby does at one point assert that trans-identified womanhood is part of reality.
Well, does reality matter at all to you? Because the reality is I am a woman.
But there isn't a discussion that extends from that. And I don't think anybody was expecting the video to say that, yeah, trans-identified males aren't really women, but they look like women, so that's what's more important. That would be an absurd conclusion to reach. In terms of whether or not trans-identified males are actually women, it really doesn't matter that they look like women. All that matters is the reality that they are not women. This video opens up with a prologue of sorts where Tabby is debating Contra's recurring radical feminist character called Abigail Cockbane. This section ends by fading out while Cockbane expresses the radical feminist criticisms of trans activist misogyny.
And something must be done about the encroaching trans agenda, taking away women's rights, invading women's spaces, depriving us of what feminism has worked so hard.
This is part of a general trend of Contra including radical feminists stating radical feminist points of view and then just ignoring it. Contra never counters the radical feminist claim in this video and instead just lets the audio fade out to move on to other things. Despite Contra's unwillingness to engage with the feminist critique of trans activist misogyny, I would just like to say that for the record, Contra is a tremendous misogynist in this video.
Yes, you are, bitch.
The standard criticism of trans identity is that it turns gendered expectations placed on women from something that should be opposed unreservedly to something that defines somebody as a woman, and Contra all but admits in this video that this is how trans identity is conceived of herein. I mean, even when the video isn't being explicitly misogynistic, it's being so by proxy. Contra literally says that men are in charge and they define what being feminine looks like, so trans-identified males should imitate that.
Well, men have the power, men make the rules, and it's ultimately men who are the judges of womanhood, so you can't really blame me for having to deal with that situation.
This is the problem though. From a gender-critical perspective, women are biological females and men are biological males, and gendered expectations that are largely theorized by men within a patriarchal system can basically be dismissed. If biological males try to conceive of themselves as women though, they are likely to latch on to the most prominent way of understanding women in terms other than biology, which is patriarchal expectations of femininity. Contra pretty much admits this is what trans identity is about, endorsing patriarchal expectations of femininity by grounding your claims to being a woman in those expectations. Contra goes further and basically says that the way that men conceived of women as this mystical feminine essence is what trans identity should be anchored in.
Where does your idea of womanhood even come from then? Das ewige Weibliche, the archetype of the eternal feminine.
Despite that being utterly contrary to what should be the feminist contention that femininity is not some privileged virtue and shouldn't be regarded as an expectation or basis for being a woman. Contra also at one point says that gender isn't a matter of opinion.
It's all a matter of opinion, or is it? It's not.
I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but at first glance it would appear to be asserting masculinity and femininity as having some kind of objective legitimacy. Contra also appeals to Judith Butler to justify this sexist conception of womanhood.
Haven't you read Judith Butler? Gender is performance. We're all born naked, and the rest is literally drag. Womanhood is not what you are, it's what you do.
This is supposed to be adding some legitimacy to Contra's idea of trans identity as a performance of traditional femininity, but all it's doing is reminding us that these sexist ideas aren't unique to Contra, but are endemic to the entire idea of trans identity. The most misogynistic Contra gets is when comparing being a woman to being like a teacher or a doctor.
You can become a teacher, a doctor, or a woman, but you have to work to get there.
So in other words, being a woman would be a job that you do, a role you perform. That is just straight up 1950s sexism. Likening being a woman to a job is one small step away from literally prescribing roles and responsibilities for men and women. Contra doesn't explicitly say what the job of being a woman is, but considering Contra has also already said that we should uphold patriarchal expectations of femininity, it's not hard to imagine what would be involved in the job of being a woman. And to complete this cavalcade of unrestrained sexism, Contra then suggests that it is worse to depart from gendered expectations than it is to be actively immoral.
It was much worse than morally wrong. It was aesthetically wrong. It was unfeminine.
I will take this specific moment to address a defense of Contra that might be made to all of my criticisms in this section. Some might say that Contra is just describing the attitude of society. Contra isn't saying that the worst thing you can be is unfeminine, rather, this is what society says, and Contra is talking about how things will be perceived. I have two issues with this. Firstly, I reject the premise. In the specific context of the previous clip, Contra is talking about threatening people with violence for disagreeing with you. To say that the principal objection to this is that it's unfeminine is ridiculous. Most of society recognizes that threatening people with violence for disagreeing with you is morally wrong in itself without considering gendered expectations. Moreover, while society certainly is still unfortunately very gendered, I don't think most people see a biological male threatening people with violence in a debate and think, ugh, that's not very feminine.
You cut that out now, or you'll go home in an ambulance.
Yeah, that seems mildly inappropriate for a political discussion.
Indeed, Contra seems to be operating on the false assumption that trans-identified males are even particularly expected to perform femininity. I don't object to Caitlyn Jenner threatening people with violence because of some expectation of femininity that I would impose on a biological male. Rather, I object because it's a horrible thing to do that shouldn't be encouraged in society. However, my second issue is that even if Contra was right with the premise that society is as neurotic about gender as would be implied by this condemnation of being unfeminine, that still wouldn't justify Contra not criticizing this attitude. Contra's solution presented in this video is clearly to be more feminine to avoid society's ire. Even if that isn't an explicitly misogynistic position, it's at least profoundly anti-feminist. I also feel like this extends from the false belief amongst trans activists that people have a problem with trans identity because trans-identified males aren't feminine enough. I've seen many trans activists be like, oh, I'm sorry that you have a problem with how trans women aren't feminine enough for you and they don't conform to your idealized view of femininity and womanhood. And obviously, that's not the issue. The issue is that there is no good reason to say biological males can be women, and the majority of ways people conceive of biological males being women are deeply sexist. Contra is saying that trans-identified males need to be the most feminine in every possible way.
You need to be so good at makeup that every cis woman you know comes to you for advice. You need to toss your hair and cross your legs. You need to smile even at people who hate you. Eliminate every aggressive impulse. You must be a blossom floating along the surface of a stream.
And yeah, maybe that would appease some gross male misogynists, but why would you want to appease them? Meanwhile, the women concerned about their rights and carrying on the legacy of radical feminism just get ignored by Contra entirely. It tells you a lot about Contra when you look at whose concerns are taken seriously. Conservative men who demand conforming to an idealized view of femininity, they get their concerns taken seriously. In fact, more than that, Contra will say, yeah, you probably should try to accommodate that. Meanwhile, radical feminists, they don't even get to finish their sentences in this video. Contra is showing you who the more immediate allies of trans identity are here. I will say, to give credit where it's due, that Contra does say that it's wrong to be menacing radical feminists with a baseball bat.
I mean, with the Nazis it's one thing, but you cannot be menacing radical feminists with a bat.
Admittedly, Contra seems to be saying that it's just bad optics. I'm not sure if Contra actually recognizes that this is morally wrong. Nonetheless, it's honestly refreshing to see a trans activist speak negatively against violence silencing their critics in any context. There are generally two core objections to trans identity. The first is of course the already covered one, that trans identity is misogynistic when they try to establish some material basis for trans identity and inevitably land on performing femininity. The second objection emerges when instead there is no attempt at all to ground trans identity in anything material, and it instead just becomes a circular definition with no material referent, whereupon it becomes incoherent. The thing is, to be fair, Contra is so unabashedly misogynistic that actually Contra generally avoids an incoherent conception of trans identity. In Contra's view, you are a woman if you perform femininity. That's disgustingly misogynistic, but it's at least coherent. Contra goes so far as to say if you're a trans-identified male early in transition, then you're just pretending to be a woman.
So, trans women just starting their transition are pretending to be women? I mean, isn't that kind of what it felt like? You transition the same way you get anywhere in life. You fake it till you make it.
So trans identity isn't just a circular definition where you are a woman because you identify as one. Instead, being a woman is something you get better at as you bring yourself more into conformity with sexist femininity. Now, you might think that seeing as Tabby is supposed to be the trans-identified male who's not so committed to performing femininity, there would be some pushback from Tabby. But not really. Tabby says that identifying as a woman is meaningful because it implies a potential to live your inner truth.
Identifying as a woman before you transition is a psychological reality that implies a potential to live your inner truth.
Which to me sounds like basically saying that trans identity is valid because in the future you might start performing femininity properly. Nonetheless, the implication is that it is still this performance that makes you a woman, and the only sense in which trans identity is valid is because of the potential for that performance. So yeah, Contra seems pretty committed to this idea that being a woman is all about performance as defined and understood by a sexist society. Contra seems to argue that this is intuitive because an identity is meaningless unless people recognize that identity as valid.
Without action and without social recognition, the identity is meaningless.
I don't agree with this at all. Identities can be meaningfully held to absent social recognition if they are based on some kind of concrete justification. The issue is, there is no concrete justification for trans identity, so in that case the only thing they can rely on is social convention. I'm a man and I have good reasons to think I'm a man, even if nobody else thought I was. Meanwhile, for Contra, there isn't a good argument for why it makes sense to understand biological males as women, so the only possible argument is that if everybody agrees that biological males can be women, then we could say that they are because linguistic prescriptivism. Another claim I don't really agree with is that conceptions of reality don't have to be able to account for absurd hypotheticals.
That's absurd. But it's absurd because the example is absurd.
I kind of think that absurd hypotheticals are actually a good way to test theories. This is why absurd hypotheticals are so useful in ethical discussions. If your moral theory leads to morally reprehensible outcomes, that's a problem, even if it's only true in absurd hypothetical situations. If I've got a moral theory that says that murder is fine if 2 + 2 = 5, then I've got a bad ethical theory, even if 2 + 2 will never equal 5. Overall, Contra's conception of trans identity isn't really incoherent, like I said, because it's so brazenly sexist. Contra basically argues that if your trans identity is just based on identity and not based on some kind of performance, then it might as well be identifying as an attack helicopter.
If womanhood is nothing to you but a private daydream, then you may as well do what those assholes say and identify as a helicopter, because unless you're living womanhood, the identity is literally that meaningless.
Obviously, I don't disagree that identity for identity's sake is absurd. However, my instinct would be to respond to this by abandoning the entire idea of trans identity, rather than anchoring trans identity to sexist expectations placed upon women and insisting these validate somebody being a woman. The thing is, any time that these trans-identified males theorize being a woman, there's something that jumps out. Their claims of being a woman are so detached from those of actual women. Even when Contra tries to suggest that performing femininity is the same for biological males as it is for women, a tiny bit of honest engagement with the experiences of actual women shows this to be false. Women don't have to put on this performance. Women don't have to theorize about how their identities as women make sense. Women don't have to worry about how absurd hypotheticals might present issues for the basis of their identity as women. Contra says that society needs to endorse your identity as a woman.
And ultimately, society has to let you. What do you mean? I can identify as a doctor and go around handing out diagnoses, but if no one recognizes me as a doctor, then I'm not really practicing medicine, am I?
But this isn't true for women. If a woman is incorrectly assumed to be a man, it's a mistake without ambiguity, because a biological referent for being a woman is anchored to material reality itself. It's only definitions that are less justifiable that rely entirely on society agreeing and nobody rejecting it. Think the Emperor's New Clothes as an example. The Emperor might be told that society needs to recognize your clothes, but in reality, it doesn't matter whether society recognizes your clothes as long as you're actually wearing them. At one point, Contra says,
Either you're perceived as a woman or you aren't. There's no reasoning your way into it.
But this simply isn't true. The gender critical argument is based on the fact that there is a reason to say that biological females are women, and there is not a reason to say biological males can be women. If there were a good reason given, then that would definitely give me pause in continuing with the current intellectual position of my YouTube channel. When these trans activists say that the categorization of women as women isn't based on any reason, they're not actually describing reality. Of course, our recognition of who is a woman is based on some reason, just as basically all categorizations and definitions are based on some kind of reason. I think a very good debate question against a trans activist is, what are your reasons for saying biological males can be women? Because I can certainly give a multitude of reasons for saying that they can't be. All trans activists are admitting when they say you can't reason your way into being a woman is that they can't come up with a reason for why they should be considered women. I have a confession, I really didn't enjoy scripting this. I had some idea of how I wanted to structure things going into it, but as I was writing, the absence of very many clear arguments from Contra just really got to me. I have to draw out the arguments from these narrative performances, then respond to them. That's hard and tedious, and also very frustrating when the whole time you know that any ContraPoints fan could just come along and accuse me of misrepresenting and seeing arguments that weren't actually there and not actually responding to Contra's central point, which they'll insist was very clearly made. I actually have had several commenters on my previous ContraPoints responses telling me to check out this video because it apparently elucidates a lot of key points regarding trans identity, and I can't help but just think, where? Anyway, I've done the best job I can responding to it and pointing out why I found the video to not be particularly impressive in terms of the arguments I was able to discern from it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video more than I liked scripting it. Please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and do all those algorithms. I've also, by the way, while I'm at it, hated recording this video. My throat hurts so much. So screw it. I'm not retaking that. Please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and do all those algorithm things. Also, if you give on Patreon, that is very sincerely appreciated. Goodbye.